The sun rose over the plains like a memory that refused to fade. The light was soft, pale, and bruised, sliding over the cracked fences and the leaning chimney of a home that had forgotten laughter. Evelyn Grace Carter stood barefoot at the edge of her land, the cold dirt biting into her soles. Her father's old coat hung heavy on her shoulders, too large, smelling faintly of smoke and pine. She heard the rumble of wagon wheels long before she saw them, dust rising on the horizon, carried by men who didn't know the meaning of mercy. The wagon stopped before her gate, the horses stamping, their breath ghosting in the morning chill. From its seat stepped Silas Boone, the richest rancher in 3 counties. His boots hit the ground with the sound of inevitability. He was tall, broad, and dressed in black that made the light slide off him. The town called him a man of business, but to Evie, he looked like a man carved from iron and grief. Behind him, the deputy carried papers that fluttered in the wind, the kind that took things away with words instead of guns. Evie's throat tightened. Her heart beat against her ribs like a trapped bird. She whispered, "Please don't take my home." Her voice carried across the yard, trembling yet strong, the kind of plea that comes not from weakness, but from love. Silas stopped mid-step. The wind caught her hair, tangled it across her face, and for a moment he saw not a debtor, not a poor girl, but someone standing on the edge of her world, trying not to fall. "The law's the law, Miss Carter," the deputy said, avoiding her eyes. Silas said nothing. He had seen too many people beg, too many faces collapse into defeat. He had promised himself he'd never feel again. But something in her tone, that quiet defiance laced with despair, pulled at the edges of that vow. The men began marking the boundaries, his men, her land. They hammered stakes into the soil her father once plowed. She didn't cry. Her lips trembled, her eyes shone, but no tears came. Instead, she turned to the horizon and whispered to no one, "If a home can be taken by law, then mercy must belong to men. Do you have none?" The question hung there like smoke. Silas looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years, the weight of his wealth felt heavier than his loneliness. He should have walked away. That was the simple thing. But simple things rarely make peace with the soul. "You'll have till sundown to pack your things," he said finally. Evie nodded once, proud even in ruin. "Thank you, Mr. Boone. That's generous of you." He turned, ready to leave. But then the murmurs began, the townsfolk gathering at the fence, hungry for the spectacle. They whispered of her father's debts, of the Carter name that had sunk like a stone in the river. He could feel their judgment cutting through the air like barbed wire. Evie bent to gather a small wooden box from the porch, her mother's keepsakes, the last candle of her childhood. Her hands shook. He found himself speaking before he understood why. "You can stay." She froze. "What?" "If I leave you this land, the debt remains unpaid." "Then tell me what it costs." Her eyes met his, sharp as glass. Silas felt something shift inside him. The law was on his side, but something about her dignity made it feel like he was the thief instead. He looked around. The people watching, the gossip hanging in the air, the ache in his chest that no amount of money could drown. His voice came low, steady, as if the idea had been waiting for years. "Then you must be my wife." Gasps broke through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Martha Weller, the seamstress who never missed a scandal, whispered, "A Boone marrying a Carter girl? Lord save us." Evie stared at him, disbelief and fury twisting together. "You mock me." "No," he said softly. "I'm giving you a way to stay. You think I'd trade my name for pity?" He removed his hat, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not pity, Evie. It's an offer. The only one I know how to make." She turned away, storming inside, the door slamming behind her. Silence fell. The men shifted uneasily. Silas stood there beneath the porch eaves, the wind catching his coat, the dust settling at his boots. He stayed long after the others rode off. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised gold. Inside, he could hear her pacing, the creak of the floorboards, the breaking of her breath. That night, the wind howled like a hungry animal. Inside the cabin, Evie sat by the hearth, the fire burning low, shadows climbing the walls. Her father's picture stared back from the mantel, his eyes as kind and tired as she remembered. She pressed her forehead to her knees and whispered, "What would you do, Pa?" Outside, under the same moon, Silas sat beside his horse, watching the cabin light flicker. He thought of another woman once, Eliza Boone, her laughter lost to fever years ago. He'd built fences and bought land ever since, trying to keep out the emptiness. But this girl's words had cracked something open. At dawn, he knocked softly on her door. She opened it, her eyes red but calm. "If I say yes," she asked quietly, "do I lose myself?" He looked at her for a long time. "Maybe you'll find someone new." The words were simple, but something honest lived inside them. They married that afternoon in the small church on Main Street. No flowers, no music, just dust, sunlight, and the tired sigh of the preacher. When the vows were spoken, Evie's voice barely reached above a whisper. Silas slipped a ring, plain in gold, onto her finger. Outside, the townsfolk watched from doorways, whispering their judgments like wind through grass. In the days that followed, life took on a strange, quiet rhythm. Evie worked on the ranch, feeding the horses, mending fences, carrying water from the creek. Silas rarely spoke, his presence steady but distant. They moved through the house like two ghosts learning to share the same haunting. And yet, little by little, the air changed. One evening, Evie stood in the barn brushing a mare's mane, humming softly to herself. Silas paused at the doorway, listening. The sound carried through the hay-dusted light, delicate as breath. He didn't say a word, just leaned against the frame, letting the tune remind him what peace sounded like. When he brought her warm bread the next morning, she took it with a small nod. Their fingers brushed, barely a second, but enough to make his pulse stutter. She smiled faintly. "You make good bread for a rich man." He almost smiled back. "You make quiet feel like home." They didn't touch again for days, but the silence between them grew softer, like fabric worn, smooth by use. Then came the storm. Thunder rolled over the hills, rain slashing through the valley. The lower fields began to flood, the cattle trapped against the wire. Before Silas could reach the barn, Evie was already on horseback, riding into the downpour. Her hair clung to her face, her skirts whipped by the wind. He shouted for her to stop, but she didn't hear or didn't care. He followed her into the darkness, the rain blinding, the river swelling like a beast. He saw her in the distance, cutting the ropes, freeing the animals. She slipped once, almost fell, and something inside him broke loose. When they finally returned, soaked and trembling, she could hardly stand. He pulled her close without thinking, wrapping her in his coat. She didn't resist. Her face pressed against his chest, his heartbeat loud beneath the storm's echo. "I didn't want to lose them," she murmured. "I didn't want to lose you," he said, and this time there was no hesitation. The fire that night burned brighter than usual. They sat close, not speaking, just listening to the rain's soft retreat. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining, fragile but sure. Days turned into weeks, and the gossip in town began again, about how the rich man's heart had thawed, how the poor girl had tamed him. Silas ignored it all. When someone at the saloon called her that charity bride, he left his drink and said, "She's my wife because she's the only one brave enough to love this land as I do." No one spoke after that. Evie heard of it later from the grocer's wife. When she asked him if it was true, he only shrugged, that rare ghost of a smile tugging his lips. A man can't let folks rewrite his story. And so they went on, building fences, mending walls, planting the first new crops on the land that nearly slipped away. She painted the shutters blue one morning, and he didn't stop her. At night, they sat on the porch together, watching the stars come out, the silence between them filled with something close to peace. Sometimes he would reach for her hand, rough and calloused from work, and she'd let him. Sometimes she'd rest her head on his shoulder as the crickets sang. They didn't speak of love, not in the way most people did. But every gesture, every loaf of bread, every quiet glance, was a vow renewed. Years later, folks still told the story of how Evelyn Carter pleaded for her home, and Silas Boone gave her his name instead of taking her land. Some said it was pity, some said it was pride. But those who looked closer, who saw the way they stood together at dawn, knew it was something quieter, deeper. A kind of love that grows not in the shouting, but in the staying. And if you were to pass their porch in the early morning light, you might hear the faint creak of a rocking chair, see two silhouettes watching the field sway. You might think they were just another couple watching the day begin, but if you listen close, you'd hear a story written not in words, but in mercy. Because sometimes mercy wears a strange face. Sometimes love begins not with a kiss, but with the quiet act of staying. And in that act, a poor girl found her dignity again, and a rich man found his heart. The plains kept their secrets, the sky their silence. But for those who remember, the tale of Silas and Evie is a whisper on the wind, a reminder that even in the harshest lands, kindness can take root and bloom where no one expects it. And maybe that's all any of us are trying to do. Hold on to something good long enough for it to matter. So if you ever feel lost, if the world seems set against you, remember her voice, the tremor, the courage, the plea. Remember the man who stopped listening to the crowd and started listening to his heart. Because love, like the land, is worth fighting for. And if this story touched you, stranger, then maybe you too know what it means to stay.